Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next session, which is all about co-creative practice in South Africa and the wider diaspora. I am really excited to have Joy Gregory and Zana Masombuka with us. I will introduce them both separately. Joy Gregory is a British artist whose work explores concerns related to race, gender, and cultural differences in contemporary society. Gregory was born in Bicester in 1959 to Jamaican parents. She grew up in Buckinghamshire and went on to study at Manchester Polytechnic and the Royal College of Art. She's developed a practice which is concerned with social and political issues, with particular reference to history and cultural differences in contemporary society. As a photographer, she makes full use of the media, from video, digital, analog photography to Victorian print processes. In 2002, Gregory received the Nesta Fellowship, which enabled her the time and freedom to research for a major piece around language endangerment. The first of this series was the video piece Gomorrah, which premiered at Sydney Biennale in May 2010. She is a recipient of numerous awards and has exhibited all over the world, showing in many festivals and biennials. Her work is included in many collections, including the UK Arts Council collection, Victoria Albert Museum, Institute of Modern Art, Brisbane, Australia, and Yale British Art Collection. She currently lives and works in London. Joy. And we have with us also Zana Masombuka. Zana Masombuka is a young Johannesburg-based conceptual art director who draws inspiration from her upbringing in rural, and I'm going to have to ask Zana to help with the pronunciation here. I don't want to mess it up. Zana, in KwaNdebele, I think. KwaNdebele.
Yes.
Okay, and it's in. Thank you, Zana, and it's in a small town called Siyabuswa.
Yes,
okay, fantastic. She's an international studies graduate from Stellenbosch University, where she learned the art of critical thinking as well as the importance of globalization and how it continues to impact Africa. Her art speaks to Africa's active role in the next wave of this global phenomena and how African artists aim to pioneer the stories being written about their continent and its people, which is fundamental to the preservation of its heritage. In the reinvention of Africa, Edward Said, V.Y. Mudimbe, and beyond, Matsuru states that Africans need to interpret their history themselves and seeks to reinvent Africa in their own terms. Therefore, Ndibele Superhero is a platform that allows her to speak of the stories of the past and present and to reimagine the future of her people. I am so excited to have Joy and Gregory in conversation together. I think it will speak to a lot of the questions we have been asking today at the International Festival of Co-Creative Change around power and story making and empire. So I'm going to hand over to Joy. There's a small presentation and then it will go on to Zana. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that, Fozia, for a lovely introduction. I'm really happy to be speaking here with Zana today. I'm going to do a little tiny presentation just to introduce my practice and in relation to plants, and to talk a little bit about collaboration and how it influences the way in which I actually work. I'm going to try and share my screen. Oh, select PDF file. I'm not very good at this. Here we go. Hooray, got it there. Right, so I'm going to show you a little bit about the beginning of my working with plants. So as Fozia said, I grew up in Buckinghamshire. I basically grew up just outside, well, very close to the countryside or in the countryside. And when I moved to London, I was very influenced by, I missed plants. I missed just things that I used to take for granted, just like walking past flowers all the time and things like lying in fields and things that you do take for granted when you grow up somewhere like that. And for some reason, I got really interested in the idea of drawing those plants, all those making images from those particular objects as cyanotypes. And I ended up making cyanotypes because I was quite influenced by I suppose a pioneer of the 19th century in photography, called Anna Atkins, who was the first person to actually start working with cyanotypes, which was a process developed by Sir John Herschel. It's an iron printing process, so it's quite easy to do, and quite, well, I was going to say it's not a fast process, but it works well. And I ended up making this work called Language of Flowers. And it was because it talked about the idea of language, but the idea of secrecy and secret messages to people, usually around love, because there were flowers and things, but sometimes not. And I used cyanotype because it seemed like the most appropriate thing to use at the time, just because it's a language from the 19th century, and then it was also used in a process from the 19th century. And I worked on different types of paper because I've always been really interested in the idea of the material. And, you know, and I suppose a lot of my work, I actually, right at the beginning of my practice, was very much about responding to things that were around me, but also to things that I was asked. So I was working at that time with the Zelda Cheetle Gallery, and I think there was a client that was interested in sort of looking or making a big wall piece around the language of flowers. And so I started to develop more of these works around that. And it was quite, for me, it was quite an enjoyable thing to actually work on, but also to think that it actually had a purpose at the end as well. And yes, and the idea of sort of like something with meaning, something with stories was also really important to me, because it's something I've developed more as my practice has developed, as grown. This idea of stories and storytelling and meaning within both the medium and within the objects. So, and also making, you know, the thing about making these prints was not to make them so that they looked exactly like the print, so that the audience or whoever was looking at them would bring something of themselves to the image. So this is a daffodil, and you can tell that it's a daffodil, but maybe you can't, because it's sort of like, it has an essence, but it doesn't actually define all daffodils. It's sort of like, what different daffodils can be. Oh, we go. Right, so during the lockdown, I'm going to go back a little bit. So during last year, during the pandemic, well, when we were locked down here in the UK, and everybody had different sorts of lockdowns, I started to pick up plants on my walks, and not with any purpose, just because I found the walks really comforting, and also it became a place of community. And I think it was the first time for a really long time that myself, and I think many other people, had a chance to commune with nature in some shape or form. Because I think when you live in a city, and in a really fast city, you're always thinking about things in your head. You're never actually thinking about things that the here and the now, and the things that are in front of you. And for me, it really, really slowed me down. And I began to notice things like, the seasons. So like the shift from the end of winter into spring, into summer, being something new happening on my walk every single day. And I would respond to that by picking something up that spoke to me. So it was for the first time for a really long time that I was listening to what nature was telling me. And this led to development of a work which became part of a project called Breath is Invisible, which is in itself called the invisible life force of plants. And that was a hollyhock there. So to go back, the hollyhock, which I then showed again sort of like with a collaborative thing in a in another space in Portugal, in a festival called a Dobradica, which is the inaugural festival there in Macau, sorry. I'm trying to, the slides are very slow. So yes, and one of the things I observed when I was making these prints was the breath. So breath being invisible, also the breath of the plant became visible on these on the photographic paper and left like an aura around the plant. So that was the plant breathing, and it was something I'd never even thought about previously. And I connected it with all the research I've been doing prior to that on, I suppose, the bioeconomics and plants in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, and how, you know, plants became this economic thing, so economic botany. But each of these, so plants are moved around the planet for different purposes and different meanings, and also for people to collect things. And then, you know, gardens became like laboratories. So I think about Kew, and I think about the botanic gardens in Jamaica. You know, that you don't, I mean, like, you often go there for walks of beauty, but actually they were started as laboratories. I'm just going to rush through these. So these are some of the works I made for that. And with this work, it was sort of collaborative. Well, it was collaborative, really, because although I had the ideas for making the work, the ideas for making the exhibition actually came from doing a series of workshops at the Harrow Youth Club in North London, and working with a group of young boys, and reflecting on the importance of plants to us as people, and how important they are for our, or not even important, how essential they are for our survival, and sort of that, I suppose, a symbiotic relationship. This is the exhibition that was on in North London. And it was obviously during the pandemic, it was outside the building, which for me was sort of like an ideal exhibition, because it meant everybody could see, everybody had access. I mean, often with you know, art practice, I mean, like, it sits in galleries, and you have to go through a door, which I know when I was a young artist starting out, something I was really frightened to do, is take all my courage to actually go into those spaces. So yeah, so it was a delight to be outside. It was also next to a bus stop, and so people would not only pass it as walking, but they'd see it on the bus stop as well, and maybe they'd get off the bus and have a look, or they'd stand at the bus stop waiting for the bus, and really be able to enjoy the work, not of just myself, but also of the young people that I worked with. Another work I've been doing for a long time, I talked a little bit, Fozia talked a little bit about the work I started with my Nesta, which was an endangered language project. And the first one I did was in Spain, in the Canary Islands, which is a whistling language. And another language I was really interested in working with was the language called Ngu, which I probably pronounced wrong, which is an endangered, well, it was an endangered language. Now it's pretty much a moribund language, which is spoken in the Kalahari, and it's the last of its language group. And I think there are only now probably 2 speakers. But what for me drew me to this particular language was the fact that it was used as evidence in a court of law to win a case, and the idea of something that was not to use something intangible to do that was quite magical for me. But then it's become more about working with the community, and thinking about how that work can actually develop as a work that is for all. So that's why it's taken me so long to work on that. I'm going to finish this very quick. I've been here, and this is, so working with the community in the Kalahari has made me think about my own heritage, and to return to the idea of sort of like the loss of knowledge within my own community, which is the loss of knowledge around plants. And not valuing that, because of, you know, like in Jamaica, you know, people go to the pharmacy rather than to do things like my parents and their grandparents used to do, which was to heal themselves with plants in the field. And it made me, it caused me to get to start looking at the work of Hans Sloane, or the collections of Hans Sloane at the Natural History Museum, particularly the plant material. And there's me there sort of like going through the herbarium with Mark Spencer. This is the Natural History Museum in London. And what I was looking for was sort of like the connection between what he has noted down in the 17th century and what I know from my parents passing down their knowledge to me. And this is and one of those plants that was there was the peacock flower, which I've been looking at, and also this other one called the manchineel, which I've been looking at more in terms of the enslaved people around how plants were used as objects of resistance. So plants of resistance is something I've been looking at more recently with the manchineel tree, and I wrote some works to actually go with that. But anyway, I'm sure we can speak a little bit more about that later. So I'll stop sharing now. So that's my tiny, extremely fast presentation, I hope, and hopefully I'll hand over now to Zana. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was amazing, Joy. Thank you. Thank you so much. As Fozia has said, my name is Zana Masombuka. So what I've just done now in what I've just said now is it's a part of my clan names in the Ndebele language. It speaks of the origin story of the Ndebele people, and it also speaks of the connection to nature, which is Mother Nature. Mfazi, meaning the mother who was able to sustain her children in the water during a very catastrophic time. I'm a conceptual artist. A lot of my work revolves around the idea of being, what does it mean, one, to be Ndebele in the time that we are living in now? How am I changing the narrative, not only for myself, but as well as Africans just globally, and how we can better tell the stories about us, how we can better tell the stories about where we come from. I'm just trying to share my my PDF here, and it's giving me a bit of trouble. So I'll just let me just quickly figure this out. Oh, there we go. So my practice is about being through creation and expression. And what that basically means is that the fundamental sort of aspects of the Ndebele culture, and not just the Ndebele, but a lot of cultures in Southern Africa are linked to nature, and linked to the idea of creation and expression, and how that leads, and how that's intrinsically tied to co-creation and collaboration. I grew up in KwaNdebele, and for those of you who don't know, and KwaNdebele was a former Bantustan. A Bantustan was a place in which the apartheid government of South Africa had previously sort of segregated different indigenous groups into different homelands to try and exclude them from fully participating in the overall economic, social, and political growth of the country. And during that time, that's when we saw the resurgence of Umkwalo, what the world knows as communicated with one another to, you know, after the war, which happened in the late 1800s, there was a stronger sort of resurgence of Umkwalo, like I said, and it was a conversation that Ndebele people were having with each other about ceremonies that they were having, as well as it had to do with constellation, it had to do with the seasons and things like that. And, you know, growing up in KwaNdebele, for us, art was never really something that we actually did, but it was something that was embedded in. Just give me 2 seconds. I think there's a problem with this slide. I don't know if you guys are seeing As I'm changing the slides, are people able to see the images?
No, I think the next image isn't available. We
Okay,
can.
let me. Oh, there we go. I think it's taking
Fantastic.
a while. Yeah. So I'm just going to go a bit slow because I think it's taking a bit longer to sort of load. Yeah, okay. I think we're fine now. We're on track. Apologies to everyone for the technical difficulties that we're having. But like I said, for growing up in KwaNdebele, art and collaboration and nature was all sort of woven in this big melting pot. The purpose of art was to honor that which sustains you. And at the time, that which sustained us was our natural environment. And so the integration of Ndebele practice, culture, spirituality was all interwoven into the natural environment. And what you're seeing on the slide is one of my all-time collaborators. I've been working with her since my initiation, which happened in 2013. She has since passed on a month ago. Her name was Nojeke. Nojeke had been doing beadwork for years. Her mother did it, she did it. It was sort of like a generational thing. And what she was working with here, which was a favorite material, was umthanyelo. And what she would do is that we would go harvest umthanyelo nomcobosi in the field. It grows abundantly and it grows indigenous to Southern Africa. And she would take it and she would let it dry for a couple of days, and it would create for a type of structure for the Ndebele regalia. And it was something that they did when they, that they have been doing for centuries, where Ndebele people integrating the natural environment into the structure. What she was doing here is called ingolwane, meaning ring beads. So what would happen is that she would formulate the structure, and once she's done the structure, she would put the beads on top of it, and then that would then be what we wear to celebrate and to honor that which sustains us. And so, like I said, for us, the idea of collaboration, the idea of art was always about conversation. It was always about expression. It was about finding your way back to yourself, because in doing that, you find better ways to communicate and to relate with your community. And so, art was also a form of play, where it wasn't just about, it wasn't just a serious thing. It was embedded in the everyday. Children could be a part of it. I remember there were times when I was with my grandmother and we'd go gardening. And that in of itself was the play of the day. And we would be going into the garden and she'd tell me about all the different things that were growing and all the different things that would sustain me. So the idea of sustenance was in of itself embedded in how we conducted ourselves and in how we sort of interacted with the environment and the communities around us. The idea of collaboration and community was also about pride. It was about showing, I remember when we were kids with my cousins, we would each compete about who knew the most plants. It was about play. So I think the idea of play allowed for that knowing that our grandmothers were sort of trying to impart on us to live and to sort of better manifest in the bodies that we embody and the bodies that we hold. And so in 2016, 2017, I was in varsity and I was studying at Stellenbosch University. And at the time, for those of you who don't know, Stellenbosch is an extremely white space in South Africa, and it can be, a little bit suffocating for a Black person living there and studying there. And so a lot of us were looking for spaces to express ourselves, to be, and just to have freedom. Because for me, especially, given that the expression was embedded from such a young age, that the expression was the highest form of living. And so what ended up happening is that at the time when I was studying, I would collaborate. I started collaborating with young photographers who are also upcoming, who are studying at the Stellenbosch Photography Academy. And so this was a project that I did with KwaNdebele, one of my first projects, where she asked me to conceptually style the shoot. And I did this project and it got shortlisted for a Sony World Photography Award. And we were like, and I was like, obviously all of us were excited, but it was the first time I sort of saw the power of art outside of the community that I was functioning in, because the community for me was, the art was the everyday, it was everywhere. So I never felt a lack of until I moved away from home and I started seeing the impact as well as the power of art and expression. And so after that, in my final year of studying, I came back and I decided to just document my brother's homecoming. My brother had gone into initiation, a male initiation that still takes place in KwaNdebele. And it's a process that takes place over a period of 4 months. So there's different ceremonies almost every weekend. And so I wasn't able to catch the first 3 months, but I managed to get there the last month when my brother was coming home. And the energy in the air in KwaNdebele at the time was contagious. Everyone in the community was involved. And what I love most about these particular ceremonies is that in the way in which it connected the community, because during this time, it didn't matter if you were a taxi driver or you were a CEO at a company. Everyone was the same. Everyone was connected for this particular cause. And specifically the male initiation, the reason there was so much noise around it was because it happened every 4 years. And it happened in alignment, like I said, with the constellation as well as the climate of the area at the time. And so the euphoria was just magical. Everyone was excited. What you see here are old straw mats are made from Inema, which is an indigenous grass that grows here that Ndebele people and other parts of the continent have integrated into their livelihood. So back in the day in pre-colonial Africa, they would use these straw mats to write messages to each other. So as you can see, these ones are blank, but there are others that have different symbols, different geometrical shapes on them. And it was a form of communication. So if you wanted to say something, you would weave it on a straw mat, or you would paint it, or you would express it in many different ways. And so after my graduation, and I officially moved back to Johannesburg, which is the major city here in South Africa, the birth of Ndebele Superhero was born. Ndebele Superhero was ultimately a space for me to express who we can become, who we are now, and who we've been, and how all those different perspectives meet each other, and how we can better create a springboard for not only ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. And Ndebele Superhero was a space that allowed me to play. It was a space that allowed me to engage with nature, because it was, and at first when I was doing it, it wasn't an intentional thing, because I wasn't intentionally working with nature. I was just leaning on what I had seen my grandmother do, but with the perspective of a young 21st century Ndebele woman. And I shot this project that you're seeing here with Jeff Rakoto. And so at the beginning of my practice, for me, it was very important to work collaboratively with photographers, with, artisans and different people who were good at different things, for the simple reason that there was this, this Western imported idea that there isn't enough. And when you look at nature, it's constantly showing you the idea of abundance. And around the same time I had started, when I shot this project, my sister and I were having conversations about the idea of exploring different and new ways of being. And so what you see here, this was a project that I did to honor my grandmother. Her name was Notukwana, meaning the lady who wears many hats. And what you see me holding are calabashes. So calabashes are very important in my culture. We use them to store traditional beer, but as well as when someone has died in the family, especially the woman, and a woman has died in the family, they break one of these things. And the reason why they break a calabash is because it's the oldest plant on the continent that has been used and integrated into everyday living. You've seen it, you'll see it in West Africa where they use it as baskets. It's also one of the oldest plants to be found on the continent that have been used by human beings. And so the idea of mother and the idea of the beginning tying into this plant and integrated into the rituals of the Ndebele. And so this was a project to honor my grandmother, to honor her spirit, and to honor how she engaged with the world, how she understood that the peace that she had internally was directly linked to the natural environment around her, was directly linked to the plant life around her. And so I further explored that in Hood Summer. And the idea here was just, the idea here around this project was play and looking at dead things, previously established and developed neighborhoods by the apartheid government of South Africa to try and improve or to try to make it seem like the Bantustan Act was working. And so this was a resort that was abandoned as a result of that. And so I wanted to speak to how, when we were kids growing up, outside of the gardens and all these different things, we didn't have parks, we didn't have libraries. And so these abandoned buildings, these dead things, were sort of our space to play. They were a space to explore and just, try to reinfigure our imagination. I later did Hood Summer, which I was speaking, further extending the theme of dead things, which I shot with John Baloy. And what I have on my head is a variation of, particularly the protea, but a variation of other plants which are very dear to the new identity of South Africa. So what you see on my head is a dead protea. And I was talking about how the post-1994 generation of South Africa was tasked with creating and carving out our identities out of nothing. Everyone was saying we're living in this sort of post-democratic South Africa, which was great, but it also had its downfalls. So we were sort of made to create beauty out of dead things. And so hence I have the proteas on my head to sort of carve out an identity for ourselves, try to remember with who we were to better create who we want to be. And so in the discovery, or rather during around the same time, my sister and I started an indigenous Southern African herb garden. And at first, we had done it because, it was an urge. It was like an urge because both my grandmothers were gardeners. They tended to a land quite a bit. And my grandfather from my paternal side was a herbalist, so he was a healer. And so the idea of nature and all these different things was very important, because then because then I always felt like my art guides me to the next space of where I needed to be. So this was a project called Time, Kadesi's Kati, and I collaborated with Themsile Mkhatshwa, as well as Era Malo, who was a photographer. Themsile was the Ndebele poet who wrote the poetry piece for this project. And what we were trying to do is, I was like, okay, since the young has the muscle, and the old have the wisdom, we need to figure out a way in which the two meet. But then the politics around it in Africa, particularly in South Africa, was that the old had so much taken away from them that they were holding on to the knowledge. The little knowledge that they had, they were holding on to it because it's what gave them a sense of identity, and it's what gave them a sense of purpose. And in the black and white image that you see, I was speaking about the youth, of how we have the zest, we have the ability to run, but we don't have the knowing. So it was about creating a type of bridge within ourselves to better understand where we were and where we wanted to go. And I as all of this was going on, I started thinking furthermore to say that the conversation that we need to truly engage in is a conversation of abundance, and it's a conversation of enoughness. In essence, it was about getting out and breaking out of what had been previously sort of expected or known, or that was the theme, getting out of that, there's not enough, there can only be one, they can, and so I was just trying to explore that. And so in the idea of there's enough and all these different things, it was also about creating a space of rebirth, because then that meant that we needed to relinquish old ideas. And 2009 was born. 2009 was basically speaking to the death of capitalism. I shot this project as well with John Baloy. It was speaking to the death of capitalism, over-industrialization, and how we need to return to remember ourselves. And so here I use the Ndebele symbol of rebirth, which is the cutting of your hair. In every major ceremony in your life as a Ndebele person, you will have to cut your hair to sort of physically mark the change that you've undergone. I was speaking about how we need to sort of venture into the space to remember where we've been, to also understand that we don't need to replicate. And so, yeah, that was the journey that I took, and how I need to understand that in the process of remembrance and in the process of co-creation, we are never alone. We come with so many people who have come before us, and all these images that you see of the other subjects in the shots were a representation of that. They were a reflection of this ancestral space that I was digging into, and it was as if we were being unearthed for the first time by Mother Nature. And so that's what I wanted to speak about in this body of work, and that led to the project isiZungu, Demystifying Isolation, and that was speaking about the plants. It was speaking about my indigenous herb garden that I'd had since 2018, and the things that it was teaching me. Because when we first had the garden, our landscaper said, "Nothing's gonna grow here, guys. It's done," and it grew, and it's literally one of the most abundant things. And so what you see here is a print from my project isiZungu, where I integrated some of the plants that we have from Ipuli, Umqobosi, Incema, Amabele, and these are all indigenous names for these different plants. So it includes grass, sorghum, different types, because there's not one grass, different types of, there's weaving grass, there's roof grass, there's all these different things. So that's what fundamentally what was happening, is that each project that I did was sort of uncovering a next thing to go, the next step of the journey.
Zana, that was so beautiful. I think we're going to open it up for questions. I love everything that you were saying. I'm going to get both of you back on. I don't know how we share, because that was beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think there's so much learning for everyone here from the things you were both saying. The Q&A is open for anyone who has questions. I have a question around, I think you both reference ancestors, and your ancestors' knowledge, in particular around botany and gardening and this kind of relationship. And I just wanted to ask how important that is in your practice, and what can we learn? What can people who are listening here learn from that in terms of how they take forward, projects that, want to have an impact on society?
It's great listening to Zana talking about all that. One of the things I was thinking about in terms of that, for me, it was a way of understanding my my own history, which is in terms of like my knowledge of that is very, very short, especially when we were talking earlier, Zana, sort of like how your father could tell you about your line going back almost infinitum. I don't know if you. So
Yeah, I think that the importance of ancestors or ancestral is that I always see, for me, through my practice, what I've learned is that bodies are archives, and it's about leaning in, and it's about creating space. Because if you think about the history of Black people and Africans in general and other indigenous people, there has been so much violence that has taken place to strip away that connection, to strip away that the importance of stillness, so that the information that you are seeking is able to come through. So what the violence has done is that it has violated the stillness space, which was a space that Africans from all different have used to commune and to understand what was happening, not only with themselves in their own bodies, but as well as in their environment. I had a conversation with an elder who's also a relative of mine about 2 years ago, and she was sick. And she had said to me, I'm so sick. They've taken me to the doctor. The doctor doesn't know what's wrong with me. And they've taken me to the pastor. The pastor doesn't know what's wrong with me. And they've taken me to a healer, and he also doesn't know what's wrong with me. And I told them that it just needs to rain. I am pregnant with spring. And so once it rains, my body will find alignment. I'm not really sick anymore. There's a misalignment. So the fact that she was able to detect that in her own body, that's due to creating moments of stillness and creating moments of communion with yourself in the everyday, so that when the big things for her in this case was the lack of rains, which was South Africa was experiencing a lot of droughts a couple of years ago. This is the first year in which we have received a couple of rains, but it still hasn't a lot. The fact that she was able to detect that in her own body is important. So I think it has to, the ancestral knowledge is there. It's about creating the space of stillness within yourself to understand and to interpret, and to understand that culture and knowledge is not stagnant. It changes and it reflects and it serves the needs of the people who are living at the time, because that's the whole point of it. So treat your body as an archive and lean into that knowledge and create space for it.
That's beautiful.
But I think it's really important that knowledge is passed on, and that's how it changes. And I think that was my interest around language, and the language project was sort of how, because of certain political choices that were made within South Africa under the apartheid system over many generations, is that the language that I was looking at was beginning to die out from 1936. And then was declared dead in 1972. And then people had to go out and look for it. And what had happened is people had buried the language because, it hadn't died, that they had to hide it in order for it to survive. And my interest in that was the fact that locked within language is the knowledge of the land, the landscape and the environment, and all of history is locked within those words, and it shifts with every generation. But if you shut it down, then it's frozen. So how do you put spring back into that?
Yes,
that's so fascinating. I love the way that you both use nature as such an important starting point for your creative practice. And it's really interesting because earlier on we had a conversation around climate change, and there was a statistic about 6% of the world's indigenous population are protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity. And these are the people that are locked out of these conversations. And it's amazing. And that kind of, just that what you were saying, Zana, getting back to stillness and getting back to that relationship. And the same thing for you, Joy, like the missing of being in the natural environment and the field. You like lying in a field if you grow up somewhere rural. And then what happens when, say, for example, in the UK, the vast majority of Black and brown folk or, POC live in cities. The vast majority do not have this relationship to the land, and how that impacts on our, just how that it has a massive impact actually on our health and our well-being in quite strong ways, So, I really appreciate how you guys really centered, nature as a really important tool actually to kind of really commune in to do some of this work. And I don't know if we've had any other Q&A, if anyone else has any questions. I can't see any coming through the chat, but in terms of for you both, was it interesting talking to each other about the different practices? Because it's really interesting that you both use this as a starting point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really fascinating listening to you, Zana, about, you know, so many objects that I think, oh yeah, the calabash is really important within the Atlantic community as well. So within the Caribbean, but I think the memory of sort of like, you know, so you say that like it would be something that would broken when a female member died within the community. I mean, that is not a knowledge that I have. So it's sort of like, it's like a ghost, like a shadow. It's there, but it's hard to have that connection. And what Fozia was saying about the gardens is about communing with nature. I think it's really important for mental health to actually feel the plants grow, to feel the earth beneath your feet. But if you live in a place where if you have that sort of behavior, it's almost criminalized, especially last year. If you lived in a city and you spent more time than you should have done in the parks, then it was almost criminalized. It was a terrible thing. But you were living in a lot of people, especially brown people, were living in these tiny little boxes with no outside space.
Yeah. And we can see it was played out, that criminalization was played out on black and brown bodies in the stats of arrests under lockdown rules. You know, it's unbelievable. Like it was like the majority, it was and that's where like the structural, you know, how our bodies are policed. I mean, that's been a big theme for the world, right? Let's face it, since Black Lives Matters, that's definitely, I mean, it's always something we've lived with, but that express, you know, the fact that we're now, this is the kind of context we're working in, with this, you know, resisting, you know, the kind of that control of the Black body in these spaces. I think it's so important. And I think going back to that understanding of nature and is a really, really vital way to look at it as well, because so many of us have been dispossessed of land, not through any not through any fault of our own, but through oppression and colonial powers, you know. So how do we make our way back, but also how do we center some of these conversations actually within, you know, within this work around co-creating change and influencing how the creative industries view this. We've just had this is not a question, but thank you so much for your beautiful presentation. So amazing to see such incredible images. And it really is. I think part of the reason I approached you both was because I really wanted to give people a space to really think about different practices and not just I think there's an assumption about Black artists and how they work as well, like, you know, that actually removes you from the rural. That removes, you know, I don't know. There's an assumption about that I think's really important to unpick. Like, how do we, you know, because with all these conversations around COP, you know, actually it's going to be, it will be people not racialized as white that will bear the brunt of what's happening and do already, you know. So then how do we start getting the creative industries to really connect up with all of these very complex questions? And I think it needs, you know, people like you need to be in the room just to read. Like, I loved what you said about stillness, something, Zana, just like, actually, you know, because here we're, and also dynamics, you know, how do we create change? How do we do this? And then actually sometimes just having the space to be still.
Yes. It's so powerful. Like I was having a conversation with my brother and my sister a couple of weeks ago, and we're speaking about my great grandfather. So my great grandfather wasn't around. He was a healer, but a traveling healer. And so my brother is named after him, and we're speaking about the theme of stillness and space. And so what I learned as the conversation unraveled was that my great grandfather was actually an astrologist. And his name, the practice of what he did was Igedla, meaning fluid. So his name was Fluid Traveling Healer in the English, even though it doesn't have an English equivalent. But it's like healing, traveling healer who follows the stars. So
That's
he had
amazing.
4 bones that he would throw on the floor, and that would dictate where he would go next. And it would always have to be in line with the constellation. So he needed to, even though it was like terrible for my grandfather to grow up without his father and all of that, but there's a fluidity and there's the sort of dynamic thing that you see happening for me, that I'm discovering that even our ancestors were not rigid. There's always this misconception that Africans or Black people are rigid, and that's not the case. There's fluidity. There's so much fluidity, more than you can't even imagine some of it. And so when you begin to uncover, and you're like, oh, that's what that is. He was just a person who lived. And for him, the stars were it. The stars, the constellation was his life. And so he gave his life to that. And so as he went along healing people, finding medicines, all these different things. He always left, after a full moon, would arrive at the new place, wherever he's going, just after the new moon has started. So it was always in connection. And I think even that, being able to get to that place, I think it's like you said, the integration of there's still moments in our lives, in our everything, going outside, working barefoot, like Joy said, working with, you need to feel the soil, because that does something for your mental health. I live in the city now, but I'm always happiest when I'm not in the city. I'm always like, I want to be outside. And at least be with the trees, be with the plants, because there's something that happens in that moment when you are in nature, when you are walking, right? There's a mindfulness that your body automatically goes under, because you have to be mindful of stepping. Yeah. So if for a moment you're out of your head, if you are out in the bush or wherever, in the forest for like 3 hours or 2 hours or 20 minutes, that mindfulness, that thing that gets you out of your head, that thing is it's important. It's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's powerful.
I just want to thank you both so much for how everyone's been blown away by the conversation. We've had, sorry, the sun's in my face. I'm just going to move. We've had a question from Sarah. She would love to see all the photos again. Everyone, I think, would love to see both the photos again. So is there anywhere that they're available? Can we share it out with the people that attended? And there are people just commenting saying how wonderful and stimulating the discussion's been. Lots of hearts. So I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to bring both of you in and for both of you to have this conversation together, because I think that's part of, I feel like this whole festival, like bringing different people together, it's just so stimulating, and it's left me thinking a lot about my own practice and how I could try and think about, connecting up more as well with that kind of really connecting up with using nature as a real force for change.